High above the Hudson River, a stone residence begins to take shape. Less a house, more a declaration. From a distance, it resembles something torn from a fairy tale, a palace perched where sky meets water. Up close, the illusion fractures. Hundreds of laborers drag limestone uphill, tunnel through rock, and balance on scaffolds where a single misstep means death. Some fall, some vanish from the record altogether. The man behind this paradise is known everywhere, John D. Rockefeller, the world's first oil billionaire, a name associated with power so vast it reshaped an entire economy. Today, visitors arrive by car and bus. They slip on headphones. A calm voice guides them through manicured gardens and echoing halls, speaking gently of family values, restraint, philanthropy. But thousands of miles away, another memory survives. Explosions at refineries, crushed competitors, broken bodies, court rulings that declared his company a monopoly. This is the other story of Rockefeller's mansion empire, a story not just about wealth, but about reinvention, about how money that once smelled like crude oil was carefully perfumed with charity. We will walk through the grand salons and the narrow servant corridors. We will compare glowing foundation reports with unpaid wages and forgotten injuries. Because these houses were never just homes, they were instruments, carefully designed to reshape how a nation would remember one man. And at the center of it all lies a blunt question. Can beauty and generosity erase the cost paid for every stone? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families behind it, support the channel. Like, subscribe, and tell me which house should be explored next. Your support makes stories like this possible. To understand what Kykuit truly represents, you must first understand what it was never meant to be. It was not designed as a monument, not a museum. Rockefeller did not build this house for future visitors to whisper about legacy. He built it for something far simpler and far more revealing. He wanted a view. The estate sits in Pocantico Hills, about 25 miles north of Manhattan. The name Kykuit comes from an old Dutch word meaning lookout. Stand on the terrace and the meaning becomes obvious. The Hudson curves below like liquid silver. Hills roll outward in layered green. On clear days, the horizon stretches endlessly. It is the kind of view that convinces you, briefly, that the world belongs to you. Rockefeller discovered this land in the early 1990s. By then, he was already unimaginably wealthy. Standard Oil controlled nearly 90% of America's refined petroleum. Money arrived faster than it could be counted. Yet Rockefeller was not a showman. He avoided spectacle. He wore plain suits. He kept quiet routines. He played golf. He handed out dimes to children, an act some journalists praised as humility, others condemned as cruelty disguised as kindness. What he sought was not admiration, but silence, and Pocantico Hills offered it. He began purchasing land discreetly, a farm here, an orchard there. Local families often had no idea who the real buyer was. Agents handled the negotiations. By the time the truth surfaced, it was too late. Rockefeller controlled thousands of acres, a private kingdom just an hour from New York's chaos. The first house was modest by Gilded Age standards, comfortable, private. Then, in 1902, it burned. A heating system, according to reports. No deaths, total destruction. What replaced it was something entirely different. The new Kykuit took more than a decade to complete. Hundreds of workers returned season after season. Stonecutters, carpenters, plasterers, gardeners, engineers. They shaped terraces, carved balustrades, and raised walls block by block. The result was a 4-story classical revival mansion clad in gray stone, 40 rooms arranged around light, symmetry, and dominance over the landscape. From below, it looks eternal. From above, it looks inevitable. Formal gardens cascade down from the mansion in measured terraces, designed by William Wells Bosworth, the same architect who would later help shape Rockefeller Center itself. Every path feels intentional, every axis directs the eye. Beneath the surface, tunnels run quietly between service buildings, allowing staff to move without ever being seen. The machinery of comfort stays hidden. Around the estate sit a coach barn, a playhouse, a tea house. There are grottos carved into stone, fountains murmuring constantly, sculptures placed where they catch the light just right. It is an entire world, self-contained and meticulously controlled. Adjusted for modern inflation, the cost of building Kykuit reaches into the tens of millions of dollars. The exact number remains elusive. Rockefeller kept careful ledgers, but the estate was never built all at once. It evolved in stages, with revisions, expansions, and refinements added over years. What can be said with certainty is this: cost was never a limiting factor. And yet, Kykuit does not shout. This was not Newport's breakers drowning in gold leaf and imported marble. There are no screaming displays of excess. Kykuit's beauty is disciplined. The proportions are classical. Ornament is measured, almost restrained. The house does not announce wealth, it implies permanence. The message is subtle but unmistakable. Not "look how rich I am," but "look how stable, how cultivated, how inevitable." That distinction mattered deeply. The Rockefeller fortune was not inherited. It was not softened by centuries of aristocratic tradition. It was new money, newer than anything America had ever seen. And new money in the Gilded Age came with suspicion. The great industrialists were admired and feared, but rarely respected. Their names appeared in headlines alongside words like monopoly, exploitation, and greed. John D. Rockefeller understood this reality with absolute clarity. He knew that wealth alone could not secure his legacy. Money could be challenged, divided, or taken. Reputation could not. If his family was to endure, if their name was to be woven into the nation's story, he needed something heavier than capital. He needed stone. The stone came from quarries. The money came from somewhere far less romantic. To understand how Kykuit was funded, you have to travel backward, roughly 3 decades before its foundations were laid. You have to go to Cleveland, Ohio, just after the Civil War, a city thick with smoke and ambition, rail lines crisscrossing its streets, factories burning day and night. It was there that a young bookkeeper named John D. Rockefeller noticed something others ignored. Oil had been discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859, and the industry that followed was pure chaos. Independent drillers punched holes wherever land was cheap. Some struck oil and became rich overnight. Others lost everything just as fast. Prices swung violently. Boom towns appeared and vanished, leaving behind mud, wreckage, and empty storefronts. Rockefeller studied this disorder and made a decision that would redefine American capitalism. He would not drill for oil. He would refine it. Crude oil was useless until it was processed into kerosene, the fuel that lit America's homes. Refining was the choke point. Whoever controlled it controlled everything upstream and downstream. Drillers would have no choice but to sell. Consumers would have no alternative but to buy. In 1870, Rockefeller and his partners formed Standard Oil of Ohio. The company was lean, methodical, and unforgiving. Rockefeller ran it with almost mechanical discipline. Costs were cut relentlessly, waste was eliminated, efficiency became doctrine. Behind closed doors, he negotiated secret rebates with railroads, quiet agreements that granted Standard Oil lower shipping rates than any rival could access. Competitors who struggled were offered buyouts. Those who refused found themselves undercut until survival became impossible. The strategy had a name, though Rockefeller never used it publicly. Historians would later call it horizontal integration. Acquire every refinery, control every pipeline, remove every alternative. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled an estimated 90% of all refined oil in the United States. 90%.
It is a number that still feels unreal. Imagine a single corporation controlling 9 out of every 10 gallons of fuel sold today. That level of power reshapes markets, politics, and lives. It meant Rockefeller could influence prices almost at will. It meant independent oilmen faced submission or destruction. It meant entire towns rose or collapsed based on decisions made in Standard Oil's offices. And it meant that the fortune accumulating behind Rockefeller's quiet demeanor was unprecedented, wealth so vast it demanded transformation into something more lasting, something carved from stone. But there was a cost. There is always a cost. The refineries that fueled Rockefeller's fortune were perilous environments. Workers handled volatile chemicals, fed massive machines, and breathed air saturated with fumes. Safety standards were minimal, often non-existent. Shifts were long. Pay was just enough to survive. Accidents were routine. Fires tore through facilities. Explosions ripped metal apart. Men were burned. Men were killed. Entire families lost their primary source of income in a single moment. The historical record is thin. Standard Oil did not release detailed accident statistics. Local newspapers occasionally reported refinery disasters, but the stories were brief, quickly replaced by the next headline. What remains today are fragments. A name listed in a coroner's ledger, a line in a church burial register, a small payment recorded to a widow in a company account book. These fragments are easy to miss. When you stand on the terrace at Kykuit and watch the sun sink into the Hudson, you do not think about a man whose name has been erased by time, a worker who died in a Cleveland refinery in 1878. The connection between his death and this view is invisible, but it exists. This is the central tension of the Rockefeller story. The same fortune that funded universities and hospitals came from an industry that consumed workers and replaced them without pause. The same efficiency praised by economists destroyed small businessmen who could not survive the pressure. The same wealth that supported public health initiatives originated in secret rebates and predatory pricing.
By the 1890s, journalists began to pull at these threads. They were called muckrakers, investigative reporters who believed the public deserved to know how power truly operated. The most influential among them was Ida Tarbell. Her father had been an independent oil producer, one of the many ruined by Standard Oil's tactics. What began as personal curiosity became a methodical investigation. Between 1902 and 1904, Tarbell published a series of articles in McClure's magazine exposing the inner workings of Standard Oil. She documented the railroad rebates, the corporate espionage, the deliberate destruction of competitors. It was one of the first great achievements of American investigative journalism. Tarbell did not topple Rockefeller, but she changed him. The public image of the quiet Baptist philanthropist fractured. In its place stood a monopolist whose power appeared incompatible with the ideals of fair competition. Public opinion hardened. Politicians took notice. Federal investigators began assembling a case. And while this scrutiny intensified, while headlines multiplied and legal briefs thickened, Rockefeller did something else entirely. He continued purchasing land in Pocantico Hills, quietly, patiently, one parcel at a time. He planned a house overlooking the Hudson River, a house built of stone. The timing was not accidental. Kykuit was never merely a residence. It was not just an escape from business pressures. From its conception, it was something far more deliberate, a stage, a statement, a place where the Rockefeller name could be associated with permanence, culture, and restraint, rather than smoke, fire, and broken bodies. The strategy was simple: replace one image with another. The question was whether it would succeed. The courts were about to decide. The answer arrived on May 15, 1911, and it was uncompromising. The Supreme Court of the United States ruled unanimously that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly. The company had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act through decades of predatory behavior, secret agreements, and systematic elimination of competition.
Chief Justice Edward White delivered the opinion. The language was restrained, technical, precise. The conclusion was unmistakable. Standard Oil had to be dismantled. The court ordered the trust broken into 34 separate companies. Their names would become familiar over the next century. Standard Oil of New Jersey, later Exxon. Standard Oil of New York, eventually Mobil. Standard Oil of California, future Chevron. It was the largest corporate breakup in American history to that point. The ruling was meant as punishment. It was intended to weaken Rockefeller's power. Instead, it did the opposite. Before the dissolution, Rockefeller owned roughly 25% of Standard Oil. Afterward, he retained approximately the same share in each of the 34 new companies. And those companies, now operating independently and freed from constant antitrust scrutiny, entered a new era. The automobile was rising. Demand for gasoline surged. Stock prices climbed. Within 2 years of the ruling, Rockefeller's personal fortune had reportedly doubled. By some estimates, it peaked around $900 million in 1913, an amount equivalent to tens of billions today. He became, by nearly every measure, the wealthiest private citizen of the modern age. The irony was almost surgical in its precision. The court had condemned his empire, it had ordered it torn apart, and the result was that John D. Rockefeller emerged richer than ever before. Meanwhile, in Pocantico Hills, construction did not slow. Stone continued to rise, gardens continued to take shape. Mansion overlooking the Hudson moved steadily toward completion, and with it, the careful rewriting of a legacy continued. Stone continued to climb the hill. Masons hauled blocks into place. Landscape architects shaped terraces. Tunnels were cut beneath the earth, linking service buildings in quiet lines. Kykuit rose methodically, piece by piece, during the same months John D. Rockefeller's name was filling newspaper columns as a convicted monopolist. That timing matters. Rockefeller was not impulsive. In business, every move he made was calculated, designed for long-term advantage. There is no reason to believe he approached his legacy with less care. Kykuit was not an escape from the verdict, it was an answer to it. Look closely at what the estate communicates. Classical architecture, balanced proportions, formal gardens echoing European tradition, sculpture and art chosen with restraint. Nothing here speaks of excess. Everything speaks of cultivation and endurance. The message is unmistakable. This is not the residence of a robber baron, but of a patron, a man whose wealth supports culture, order, and refinement. The cost was enormous. Surviving records suggest millions of dollars were spent, a sum that would equal tens of millions today. For Rockefeller, the expense was insignificant. His investments produced more income in a single month than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. The house was not a real estate project, it was a reputational one. And it was only the first phase. The years surrounding Kykuit's completion also marked the full activation of Rockefeller's philanthropic network. In 1913, the same year the Supreme Court ruling took its final form, the Rockefeller Foundation was officially established. The General Education Board, founded earlier, expanded aggressively throughout the American South. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research poured money into laboratories and public health initiatives. The scale was unprecedented. Over his lifetime, Rockefeller donated more than $500 million, the equivalent of many billions today. Universities were built, hospitals were funded, research programs reshaped medicine, public health campaigns reached millions.
The hookworm eradication program alone treated more than 1 million people in the American South. Rockefeller-funded yellow fever research contributed to vaccines still in use today. These were not symbolic gestures, they produced tangible results. Children survived diseases that once killed without mercy. Students received educations their families could never have afforded. Scientists made breakthroughs that would define modern medicine, all supported by Rockefeller money. And yet, the timing remains impossible to ignore. The charitable expansion accelerated precisely as legal and public pressure peaked. Foundations grew as newspapers labeled Rockefeller a criminal. Good works multiplied as his reputation faced permanent damage.
Was the philanthropy sincere? Almost certainly. Rockefeller was a lifelong Baptist who tithed faithfully and believed his wealth carried moral responsibility. But sincerity does not exclude strategy. A man can believe in charity and still understand its power to shape public memory. He can want to do good and also want to be remembered for doing good. The motives do not have to be pure for the outcomes to be real. The mansions and the foundations were part of the same design. Both were built to outlast headlines. Both were meant to redefine how future generations would understand the Rockefeller name. But that leaves another question unanswered. What about the people who made it all possible? The workers, the servants, the individuals whose names never appeared on dedication plaques or foundation reports. Their story requires a different kind of tour. The official tour of Kykuit does not begin in the kitchen. Visitors enter through the main hall. They admire tapestries and sculpture. They pause at windows framing the Hudson. They walk through rooms designed for reception and display, spaces meant to project cultivated wealth. The audio guide speaks of architects and landscape designers, of classical influences and European taste. It recites the names of those credited on blueprints and art catalogs. But there is another Kykuit, a second house hidden within the first. To find it, you must leave the main staircase and look for a narrower one, steeper, less finished, a staircase intended for people who were never meant to linger or be noticed. The servants' quarters were placed on upper floors and in separate service buildings, connected by underground tunnels. These tunnels were not decorative, they were functional corridors, low, plain, efficient. They allowed staff to move between kitchens, laundries, coach houses, and the main residence without ever crossing the paths of the family or their guests. The design was deliberate. The system was built around invisibility. Historical records suggest Kykuit employed dozens of workers at any given time. Housemaids, cooks, gardeners, chauffeurs, groundskeepers, footmen. Their labor kept the estate flawless. Their presence was meant to remain unseen.
And while the grand halls told one story, these narrow passages told another, one written in footsteps that echoed only underground. The number of servants changed with the seasons and with the family's needs. Some lived on the estate year-round, others arrived each morning from nearby towns and disappeared again by nightfall. All of them functioned within a rigid hierarchy that governed nearly every aspect of daily life: uniforms, schedules, dining arrangements, even which doors and staircases they were permitted to use. The work was relentless. A housemaid in a Gilded Age mansion typically labored 6 days a week, often 12 hours a day or more. The list of duties never ended. Floors were scrubbed until hands burned. Silver was polished repeatedly. Beds were made and remade. Chamber pots were emptied. Coal was hauled. Fires were lit and maintained. After elaborate dinner parties that stretched late into the night, servants cleaned until exhaustion set in, then rose before dawn to begin again. The physical toll was severe. Skin cracked from harsh soap, backs ached from lifting water and furniture, knees wore down from years spent kneeling on stone floors and staircases that were never considered clean enough. Fatigue was constant, accepted as part of the job. Wages were modest.
A housemaid at a wealthy estate in the early 20th century might earn between $15 and $25 a month, along with room and board. Compared to factory labor, this could seem preferable. Factory hours were often longer and accidents more frequent, but comfort was never part of the equation. Servants saved what they could. Many sent money home to parents or younger siblings. Some imagined a future beyond service, a small boarding house, a laundry, a shop of their own. For most, those dreams remained distant. What survives from this world is largely silence. Servants were not encouraged to keep diaries. Journalists did not interview them. Letters, if they were written at all, were rarely preserved. History favored the owners of these houses, not the people who kept them running. The official story belongs to those whose names were carved into stone. Still, fragments remain.
Household account books list names and wages. Census records reveal who lived on the estate in a given year. Occasionally, memoirs written decades later by former servants, published when they were old and no longer bound by loyalty or fear, offer fleeting glimpses of daily life. And the architecture itself speaks. Narrow staircases hidden behind walls, small windows in service corridors, plain plaster where public rooms gleam with ornament and carved detail. The building enforces a division, two classes occupying the same structure but never the same spaces. That separation remains visible in the bones of the house. One detail stands out in the contractor's ledgers from Kykuit's construction. These are the same records that meticulously note the cost of Italian marble and French tapestries. Amid those entries appear quieter lines, payments for medical treatment, payments to families. One entry reportedly reads simply, "Payment to widow." The meaning needs no explanation. Construction in that era was dangerous. Men fell from scaffolding, stones slipped, machinery failed. Safety regulations, as we understand them today, did not exist. An injured worker might receive compensation or nothing at all, depending entirely on circumstance and employer discretion. A worker killed on the job left behind a family forced to survive without him. These deaths were not unique to Kykuit. Every great mansion of the Gilded Age carried similar risks. The breakers in Newport, the Vanderbilt estates, the Morgan houses. Grandeur was paid for not only in money, but in bodies. That part of the cost rarely appears on official tours. And after construction ended, the story did not become simpler. Once Kykuit shifted from worksite to home, the servants' experiences varied. Some stayed for years, even decades. They formed relationships with the family. They took pride in the estate and in doing their work well. In some cases, they received pensions or modest bequests in wills. By the standards of their class and time, the Rockefellers were considered fair employers. But fairness is relative. A servant who worked at Kykuit for 30 years still spent those years within a system designed to render them invisible. They climbed back staircases. They ate in servants' halls. They addressed their employers as sir and madam, while being called by their first names in return. It was not slavery. It was not overt cruelty. But it was not equality. This is the complication that any honest examination of a Gilded Age mansion must confront. The houses are beautiful. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The history is compelling. But that beauty rests on a foundation of radical inequality. The people who hauled the stone, scrubbed the floors, and cooked the meals were essential to the existence of these estates, and yet they were systematically erased whenever possible. The tunnels at Kykuit were designed so servants could move unseen. The narrow staircases ensured the family never had to share a corridor with the help. The architecture itself encoded assumptions about status and worth, about who mattered and who did not. Those assumptions remain embedded in the walls. The question is whether we choose to notice them. Kykuit was never the only one. To understand the full reach of what the Rockefeller fortune created, you have to look beyond Pocantico Hills. You have to trace the network of properties accumulated across generations, stretching from Manhattan to Maine, forming a quiet empire of residences along the eastern seaboard.
The mansion on the hill was only the beginning. In the early 20th century, the Rockefellers maintained a townhouse at 4 West 54th Street in Manhattan. The building itself was substantial, but deliberately restrained, 9 stories tall, clad in limestone, designed to blend into its block rather than overpower it. That choice was intentional. John D. Rockefeller had learned an important lesson. Visible excess invited scrutiny. Quiet wealth attracted far less attention. Better to be rich discreetly, better to let someone else become the symbol of excess. But discretion did not mean absence.
Inside the townhouse hung artworks that would later form the foundation of the Museum of Modern Art's collection. The family's presence reshaped the surrounding neighborhood, influencing what was built, who moved in, and how entire blocks evolved. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply settles in and stays. And when the time came to build something unmistakably monumental, restraint was set aside. Rockefeller Center. The name alone makes the authorship clear. The project began in the late 1920s, just before the stock market collapse that triggered the Great Depression. Originally envisioned as a partnership with the Metropolitan Opera, the plan unraveled when the economy imploded and the opera withdrew. For most families, that would have been the end. For the Rockefellers, it was merely a complication. They moved forward. What rose from the demolished blocks of Midtown Manhattan was unprecedented. 19 buildings spread across 22 acres, at the time the largest privately financed construction project in modern history. At its heart stood the RCA building, later renamed 30 Rockefeller Plaza, a 70-story Art Deco tower that would become one of the most recognizable silhouettes on Earth. The timing bordered on surreal. As banks collapsed and bread lines wrapped around city blocks, tens of thousands of workers carved a new city from Manhattan's bedrock. The irony was impossible to ignore. A fortune built through ruthless competition was now underwriting employment for men who might otherwise have gone hungry. They came from everywhere. Italian stonemasons, Irish laborers, immigrants from Eastern Europe, native-born Americans drifting in from farms and fading industrial towns. They worked at heights that would be considered reckless today, balancing on steel beams hundreds of feet above the streets below. The photograph of 11 men eating lunch on a beam, legs dangling over open air, was taken during this construction. It became an icon of American labor. The men's names remain uncertain.
One of them, call him Marco, though history does not preserve his real name, was reportedly an Italian immigrant who arrived in America as a teenager. He worked in quarries before finding a place on the Rockefeller project. The pay was decent by Depression standards. The work was terrifying. Men fell, men died, but the jobs kept coming, and Marco kept climbing. What did he think of the family whose name crowned every building? Gratitude? Resentment? Both. The record does not say. Workers of that era were not asked what they thought. They were expected to show up, do the job, and disappear again at the end of the day. What they left behind still stands. Rockefeller Center is not just an office complex. It is a permanent statement of power in steel and stone. The plaza, the skating rink, the Christmas tree that draws millions of visitors every year. Each December, crowds gather inside a tradition carefully invented and sustained by a family that understood spectacle as well as it understood capital. Yet, Rockefeller Center was never purely symbolic. It was designed to generate revenue. Offices to rent, shops to attract customers, public spaces calibrated to encourage lingering and spending. The famous artworks, the Atlas statue, the Golden Prometheus, were not placed at random. They were part of an environment engineered to feel grand, modern, and inviting. Beauty and commerce were never separate. They were components of the same plan. This pattern repeated across Rockefeller holdings. The family compound in Seal Harbor, Maine, combined sweeping coastal views with disciplined estate management. The land donations that helped establish Acadia National Park were genuine acts of conservation. They also ensured that the vistas from Rockefeller's summer homes would never be compromised by unchecked development. The philanthropy was real. The self-interest was real as well. In the minds of those signing the deeds, the two did not conflict. By the mid-20th century, the Rockefeller real estate portfolio was arguably the most valuable in America. The family owned sections of Manhattan that would be worth billions today. They controlled access to some of the most desirable landscapes along the eastern seaboard. They had built, quite literally, an empire.
But empires demand upkeep. They require labor. They depend on thousands of people who cook meals, clean rooms, tend gardens, polish stone, and repair roofs. The houses were monuments to one family's wealth. They were also workplaces for generations of Americans who would never own anything remotely similar. This left a persistent question hanging over the dynasty, a question that shadows every inherited fortune built on contested ground. What do you do with it? How do you justify it? How do you make the name mean something other than monopoly and exploitation? The Rockefellers believed they had an answer. They called it philanthropy. The giving began before the mansions were finished, but it accelerated after the verdict. John D. Rockefeller had tithed since his teenage years. 10% of every dollar he earned went to his Baptist church. This was not a performance for journalists. By all accounts, it was sincere. Faith was central to his identity. Discipline came naturally. The belief that wealth carried moral obligation was, for him, unquestioned. But there is a difference between tithing 10% of a modest income and tithing 10% of the largest private fortune the world had ever seen. By the early 20th century, Rockefeller's generosity had outgrown the capacity of any single church. Money arrived faster than it could be distributed responsibly. What was required was structure. He needed systems. He needed institutions. He needed a machine. The Rockefeller Foundation was formally chartered in 1913. Its mission statement was sweeping, almost audacious, to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. The language was intentionally broad, flexible enough to justify nearly any intervention. And over the decades that followed, it did exactly that. Public health, medical research, education, agriculture, the social sciences, the arts, few areas of modern life remained untouched. The scale alone was unprecedented. Within its first 10 years, the foundation distributed tens of millions of dollars, sums that would translate into hundreds of millions today.
Critics called it tainted money. They argued that no amount of charity could cleanse wealth extracted through monopolistic practices. Some universities refused Rockefeller donations outright. Certain churches rejected his funds on moral grounds. The debate was loud, public, and unresolved. The family's response was not defensive, it was strategic. They hired Ivy Lee, one of the architects of modern public relations. Lee understood something new and powerful. Reputation was not shaped only by behavior, but by narrative, by which stories were told, which images circulated, and which details faded into the background. He advised Rockefeller to make his generosity visible, to allow photographs, to be seen with children, to speak openly about faith, humility, and duty, to replace the image of a ruthless monopolist with that of a kindly old man handing out dimes. Gradually, the strategy worked. Public perception shifted. The robber baron softened into the philanthropist. The figure exposed in Ida Tarbell's reporting was slowly eclipsed by the name carved onto hospitals, universities, and research institutes. Rockefeller, once shorthand for greed, began to signify generosity. But the critics never disappeared, and with distance, their arguments have only sharpened. The problem with philanthropy on this scale is not that it fails to do good, it often does immense good. The problem is power. A foundation with hundreds of millions of dollars can shape public priorities in ways no ordinary citizen ever could. It can elevate certain research agendas while quietly starving others. It can influence policy without standing for election or facing public oversight. It can, in effect, exercise authority without accountability. The Rockefeller Foundation funded life-saving public health campaigns. It also supported eugenics research. The same institution that cured disease in the American South financed programs aimed at controlling who should reproduce. The boundary between improving humanity and defining it proved dangerously thin. This is not a simple morality tale.
By the standards of their class and time, the Rockefellers were considered fair employers. But fairness is relative. A servant who worked at Kykuit for 30 years still spent those years within a system designed to render them invisible. They climbed back staircases. They ate in servants' halls. They addressed their employers as sir and madam, while being called by their first names in return. It was not slavery. It was not overt cruelty. But it was not equality. This is the complication that any honest examination of a Gilded Age mansion must confront. The houses are beautiful. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The history is compelling. But that beauty rests on a foundation of radical inequality. The people who hauled the stone, scrubbed the floors, and cooked the meals were essential to the existence of these estates, and yet they were systematically erased whenever possible. The tunnels at Kykuit were designed so servants could move unseen. The narrow staircases ensured the family never had to share a corridor with the help. The architecture itself encoded assumptions about status and worth, about who mattered and who did not. Those assumptions remain embedded in the walls. The question is whether we choose to notice them. Kykuit was never the only one. To understand the full reach of what the Rockefeller fortune created, you have to look beyond Pocantico Hills. You have to trace the network of properties accumulated across generations, stretching from Manhattan to Maine, forming a quiet empire of residences along the eastern seaboard. The mansion on the hill was only the beginning. In the early 20th century, the Rockefellers maintained a townhouse at 4 West 54th Street in Manhattan. The building itself was substantial, but deliberately restrained. 9 stories tall, clad in limestone, designed to blend into its block rather than overpower it. That choice was intentional. John D. Rockefeller had learned an important lesson. Visible excess invited scrutiny. Quiet wealth attracted far less attention. Better to be rich discreetly. Better to let someone else become the symbol of excess. But discretion did not mean absence. But every ledger has 2 columns. For every entry recorded on one side, there is another that rarely appears on the page. The money that paid for Italian marble came from somewhere. The men who hauled it up the hill came from somewhere. The women who polished it year after year came from somewhere. Their lives are part of the account, even if they were never carved into stone. Consider a single space, the dining room. Here, the Rockefeller family entertained guests for decades. The table could seat dozens. The china was custom-made. The silver reflected candlelight like glass. On an ordinary evening during the estate's peak years, a dinner party might involve 8 courses, prepared by a kitchen staff that had been working since before sunrise. What do we actually know about those workers? In fragments, we know their names. Household records preserve them. Account books list wages and dates of employment. From the architecture itself, we can infer their conditions: the narrow service corridors, the steep staircases, the long distances between the hot, crowded kitchen and the cool, bright dining room where guests lingered over conversation. But their thoughts, their judgments, resentments, loyalties are mostly lost. Servants were not encouraged to write diaries. Historians rarely interviewed them. When they appear in the record, they are reduced to line items: a name, a wage, a role. The silence is not accidental, it is structural. And yet, some voices survive. Oral histories recorded decades later, letters sent home to parents and siblings, occasional memoirs written late in life by people who decided their memories deserved a place on paper. These sources are imperfect. Memory softens edges, perspective shifts with time, but they offer brief, piercing glimpses into a world the official tours rarely acknowledge. One former housemaid, whose account survives in an oral history archive, described her years in a Gilded Age mansion without romance and without bitterness. "The work was hard," she said. "The hours were long, the hierarchy was strict, but the pay was steady, the food was good, and there was pride in working at a place everyone in town knew." She had been part of something, even if her role was meant to be invisible. That ambivalence runs through many surviving accounts. The people who built and maintained the great houses were not characters in a simple morality tale. They were individuals making calculations. Some resented the inequality, some accepted it as the natural order. Some found dignity in craftsmanship regardless of who ultimately benefited. The same complexity appears in the broader economic picture. Standard Oil was a monopoly that crushed competitors and exerted ruthless control over markets. It also powered economic expansion, funded towns, and created thousands of jobs. The refineries were dangerous. They were also, in many regions, the best-paying work available. For workers with limited choices, that contradiction was not theoretical. It was daily life. This is not a defense of monopoly. It is not an excuse for exploitation. It is an acknowledgement that history is rarely tidy. The people who lived through the Gilded Age did not experience it as a debate between heroes and villains. They experienced it as survival, advancement, compromise, as opportunity mixed with risk, as progress entangled with cost. The ledger at Kykuit contains both columns. The fortune that built the estate came from practices that would be illegal today. The workers who constructed it faced dangers that would be unacceptable now. The servants who maintained it lived within inequalities that modern society struggles to confront honestly. And yet the craftsmanship is extraordinary. The gardens are genuinely beautiful. The art collection is undeniably significant. The philanthropy funded by this wealth saved lives on a scale of massive impact. These truths do not cancel each other out. They coexist. An honest tour of a Gilded Age mansion does not select one truth and discard the other. It does not reduce the house to a monument to greed. It does not elevate it into a shrine of generosity and taste. It holds both realities in the same frame and asks the visitor to remain there, uncomfortable. This is harder than it sounds. We want history to resolve cleanly. We want clear judgments, simple conclusions. We want to know whom to admire and whom to condemn. We want the ledger to balance. But the ledger at Kykuit does not balance. The beauty is real. The cost was real. And the people who paid that cost, the laborers, the servants, the competitors erased from the market, are largely forgotten. The final question is not whether the house deserves preservation. It is whether we are willing to remember everyone who made it possible. The gardens at Kykuit are famous. They are also a form of forgetting. Walk the terraces designed by William Wells Bosworth, and you see what generations of visitors have been invited to see. Classical symmetry carved into a hillside, hedges trimmed into disciplined geometry, fountains catching the late afternoon sun. The Hudson Valley stretches outward in carefully framed views meant to inspire calm and awe in equal measure. Nothing is accidental. Every axis is aligned. Every stone has a purpose. In the lower gardens, modern sculpture rests among the greenery. Picasso, Calder, Henry Moore, works that would command crowds in any museum, stand quietly among the trees, as if art and landscape had always belonged together, as if this harmony were natural and inevitable. The effect is breathtaking. It is also, in its own way, a sleight of hand. Gardens do not exist without gardeners. Sculptures do not place themselves. Terraces do not rise on their own. Before the symmetry, there was excavation. Before the fountains, there were trenches. Before the trees reached maturity, someone planted them knowing they would never live to see them at full height. None of those people are named in the landscape. No plaques for the men who hauled soil up the hill. No markers for those who laid drainage pipes beneath the paths. No inscriptions for the hands that shaped the ground into something visitors now experience as timeless. The garden presents itself as a gift, complete and serene, as if it emerged fully formed from taste alone. This erasure is not unique to Kykuit. It is built into the logic of historic gardens themselves. The great estates of the Gilded Age were founded on a shared assumption that nature could be disciplined by money, that beauty could be purchased, and that the work required to maintain that beauty should remain invisible. Gardeners were not meant to be seen. Their success depended on sustaining the illusion that the landscape required no effort at all. It was always a fiction. Gardens are among the most artificial environments humans create. Every tree is selected, every flower is placed, every weed removed by a person whose hands are in the soil. What visitors admire as serenity is the product of constant, exhausting physical labor, labor that never truly ends. At Kykuit, the gardening staff during the estate's peak years numbered in the dozens. They worked through every season. Summers meant pruning, planting, mowing, watering under heat and sun. Winters meant wrapping fragile plants, clearing ice from paths, maintaining greenhouses and cold frames to prepare for the next cycle of growth. The work was relentless, the pay was modest, the hours were long. Some gardeners stayed for decades. Over time, they developed an intimate understanding of the land. They knew which roses bloomed first each spring, which trees were prone to disease, which slopes browned early in drought. This knowledge was rarely written down. It passed orally, from worker to worker, from one generation to the next. A living archive, essential to the garden's survival and almost never acknowledged. And then there was the construction itself. Before the terraces became terraces, the hillside had to be reshaped. Kykuit sits on uneven terrain, and creating those flat plains required years of excavation and earth moving. Hundreds of workers passed through the project at different stages: blasting, hauling, stone cutting, drainage installation, dangerous work by the standards of the early 20th century. Here, the record grows thin.
We know the work was difficult. We know accidents were common on projects of this scale. What we often do not know are names. We do not know who fell. We do not know who was injured. We do not know which families received compensation and which were left with silence. The surviving documents offer only fragments: a payment without explanation, a gap in the books, an occasional coroner's report. The human cost appears indirectly, if at all. This absence is not empty. It is its own kind of presence. The ghosts in the garden are not supernatural. They are historical. They are the people whose labor made the beauty possible and whose lives were never considered worthy of preservation. Their stories were not carved into stone because they were never meant to be part of the story at all. In recent years, some historic estates have begun to reckon with this. Tours now include servant quarters. Exhibits focus on labor rather than lineage. Oral history projects attempt to capture memories before they disappear entirely. Kykuit has taken tentative steps in this direction. Visitors can now see the spaces where staff lived and worked. Guides acknowledge, briefly, the people who maintained the estate. But the center of gravity remains unchanged. The family, the architecture, the art still dominate the narrative. The gardens, in particular, are still framed primarily as aesthetic triumphs, not as workplaces. Perhaps this is inevitable. Gardens are designed to be enjoyed. Beauty is easier to absorb when it feels effortless. Visitors walking the terraces want to lose themselves in the view, not imagine the labor beneath their feet. From the beginning, the estate was meant to offer a particular experience: peace, order, wealth expressed as taste rather than force. But history is not obligated to serve that intention. Behind every immaculate hedge is a schedule. Behind every fountain is maintenance. Behind every moment of stillness is motion that has been deliberately concealed. The calm is real. So is the work that sustains it. The question is not whether the gardens deserve admiration. They do. The question is whether admiration must require forgetting.
Because once you learn to see the garden as a place of labor as well as beauty, it changes. The paths feel heavier, the terraces feel earned, the silence fills with voices that were never invited to speak, and the ghosts, long ignored, begin to feel less distant, no longer haunting the garden, but standing plainly within it, asking only to be remembered. The gardens at Kykuit are breathtaking, yet they are more than beauty. They are monuments to a quiet, exacting kind of power, the power to shape the land, command labor, construct a private paradise, and then erase the evidence of its making. The ghosts are still there, lingering in the terraces, the shaded paths, the echo of every shovel and hammer. They wait to be remembered. Beauty, in this sense, owes them attention. It asks little more than acknowledgement. This is the question that haunts every historic house museum in America. What does it owe, and to whom? The buildings were designed to impress. The tours are designed to educate. But educate about what? About the taste of the owners? The skill of the builders? The accomplishments of a single family? Or the workings of an entire system, one that made such splendor possible while extracting an unseen cost from those not invited to sit at the table? For decades, the standard script was familiar. Visitors entered through the main hall. Guides pointed out architectural flourishes, named the designers, highlighted the family's accomplishments. Aspiration, accomplishment, and refinement were emphasized. The houses stood as evidence of what talent and resources could achieve in America. That story was true, but incomplete. It presented only one column of the ledger, leaving the other side blank. The shift began slowly. In the 1970s and 1980s, social historians asked different questions, not simply who had power, but who lived without it, not merely what the wealthy built, but who built it. They examined the same mansions and discovered entire worlds waiting to be acknowledged. But every ledger has two columns. For every entry recorded on one side, there is another that rarely appears on the page. The money that paid for Italian marble came from somewhere. The men who hauled it up the hill came from somewhere. The women who polished it year after year came from somewhere. Their lives are part of the account, even if they were never carved into stone. Consider a single space, the dining room. Here, the Rockefeller family entertained guests for decades. The table could seat dozens. The china was custom-made. The silver reflected candlelight like glass. On an ordinary evening during the estate's peak years, a dinner party might involve 8 courses, prepared by a kitchen staff that had been working since before sunrise. What do we actually know about those workers? In fragments, we know their names. Household records preserve them. Account books list wages and dates of employment. From the architecture itself, we can infer their conditions. The narrow service corridors, the steep staircases, the long distances between the hot, crowded kitchen and the cool, bright dining room where guests lingered over conversation. But their thoughts, their judgments, resentments, loyalties are mostly lost. Servants were not encouraged to write diaries. Historians rarely interviewed them. When they appear in the record, they are reduced to line items, a name, a wage, a role. The silence is not accidental, it is structural. And yet, some voices survive. Oral histories recorded decades later, letters sent home to parents and siblings, occasional memoirs written late in life by people who decided their memories deserved a place on paper. These sources are imperfect. Memory softens edges, perspective shifts with time, but they offer brief, piercing glimpses into a world the official tours rarely acknowledge. One former housemaid, whose account survives in an oral history archive, described her years in a Gilded Age mansion without romance and without bitterness. The work was hard, she said. The hours were long, the hierarchy was strict, but the pay was steady, the food was good, and there was pride in working at a place everyone in town knew. The man vilified as a monopolist became officially remembered as a benefactor. Yet the ledger of his life remains complex. His legacy is carved in marble, landscaped on terraces, funded through foundations that saved lives. But the ghosts remain, silent but present. The men and women whose labor made this wealth tangible, whose hands touched every stone, every tree, every brushstroke of paint, those stories do not vanish. They linger in the corridors, beneath the fountains, among the hedges, waiting for recognition. History is rarely neat. Beauty and cost, creation and erasure, generosity and exploitation all coexist within the same narrative. To honor the full story, we must learn to see both sides of the ledger. We must remember the ghosts even as we admire the gardens. Only then does beauty become honest. Only then does legacy become complete. But the fortune endured. When John D. Rockefeller passed, the question of what to do with it shifted to the next generation. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., known simply as Junior, inherited not just wealth, but a mission. His father had built the fortune, yes, but he had also begun a project, the rehabilitation of the family name, the transformation of power into permanence, legacy, and public service. Junior's task was to carry it forward, to ensure that Rockefeller would mean more than Standard Oil. It had to mean institutions, culture, and contributions that would outlast any individual. Junior threw himself into the work. Rockefeller Center became his signature project, conceived and executed amid the darkest years of the Depression. The restoration of colonial Williamsburg was his vision, an entire 18th century town resurrected as a monument to American history. The Cloisters, the medieval branch of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was assembled from his collection and installed within a park he had donated. And the land that became Acadia National Park in Maine owed much of its preservation to his stewardship. The Gilded Age mansions are extraordinary. They are also monuments to an economic system that concentrated wealth while millions labored under perilous conditions for modest pay. Both statements are true. Neither cancels the other. What does beauty owe? At minimum, honesty. Acknowledgement that the marble was quarried by someone, that the stones were carried by someone, that the gardens were planted, pruned, and sustained by hands now forgotten. The ledger of labor deserves a voice. This is not a call for guilt. Guilt serves no one. The demand is simpler and more enduring: attention. The willingness to hold beauty and cost in the same frame, to see elegance and exploitation as inseparable elements of a single story. At Kykuit, this could mean tours that spend as much time in the servants' quarters as in the main hall, exhibits devoted to the workers who built the estate, or garden walks that honor the gardeners, not only the landscape architect. Small gestures, yet transformative. The house remains beautiful, the views still breathtaking, the art worth seeing. Nothing is lost by telling the whole story. Something is gained, a history that encompasses all who lived it. The Rockefeller name is etched across buildings and estates throughout America. The names of the workers who built those buildings, tended those grounds, and maintained those spaces are mostly absent. Yet the work persists. The stone endures, the gardens thrive. What we owe to beauty is the truth of its creation. The story did not end with John D. Rockefeller. He died in 1937, just weeks shy of his 98th birthday. By then, he had given away more than $500 million, the equivalent of many billions today. Newspapers that once labeled him a robber baron now printed obituaries praising his philanthropy. The transformation of his public image was complete. These were not gestures of whimsy. They reshaped the American landscape, embedding permanence into culture and nature alike. Whatever one thought of the original fortune, the institutions it created were undeniably significant, enduring in a way the kerosene that built it could never hope to. Yet the question lingered, can money wash itself clean? Can a network of hospitals, universities, and national parks erase the memory of crushed competitors and dangerous refineries? The debate that had shadowed John D. Rockefeller persisted long after his death and continues today. The third generation complicated the story further. The 5 sons of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., collectively known as the Brothers, branched into politics, philanthropy, banking, and public service. Nelson became governor of New York and later vice president of the United States. David ran Chase Manhattan Bank and emerged as one of the most influential financiers of the 20th century. Lawrence focused on conservation and venture capital. Winthrop served as governor of Arkansas. John III concentrated on philanthropy, particularly in Asia. The breadth of their pursuits made the idea of a singular Rockefeller legacy almost impossible. The family had become an institution in itself, with branches pursuing sometimes divergent, sometimes complementary agendas. The name Rockefeller carried different weight depending on which family member was in view, but the money, in all its complexity, remained tethered to its origins. Every foundation grant, museum donation, and political initiative could trace its roots, however distantly, to the kerosene that lit American lamps in the 1870s. The chain of causation was long and convoluted, but it remained unbroken. The original accumulation, the rebates, the predatory pricing, the monopoly, was the seed from which all else grew. In recent decades, some family members have confronted this inheritance directly. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, founded in 2014, announced in 2016 that it would divest from fossil fuels, a striking declaration from an institution built on oil. The statement was both practical and symbolic. Practical because fund managers judged fossil fuels a poor long-term investment, symbolic because it signaled a partial repudiation of the family's origins. Already inflicted, the carbon in the air, ecosystems disrupted, communities displaced. The fortune, however it is invested now, carries its history. Defenders describe evolution. Families, like individuals, can change. The relevant question, they contend, is not only where the money came from, but where it is going. The best use of a tainted fortune, perhaps, is to direct it toward repairing the harms it caused. Both positions are valid. Both are incomplete. The truth, as ever, resists simplification. The Rockefeller story is unfinished. The mansions still stand, the foundations still operate, the name still appears across buildings and institutions, both in the United States and abroad. The legacy continues to be written, contested, and reshaped by choices being made today. Kykuit itself now functions as a museum managed by historic Hudson Valley. Visitors walk through the rooms where John D. Rockefeller spent his final years, wander the gardens he cherished, and view the art his descendants collected. In this sense, the estate has become a monument to the very project of legacy building the family pursued across more than a century. But monuments are never neutral. They are arguments carved in stone. Kykuit's argument about taste, permanence, and the redemptive power of beauty is not offered for assent. It is posed for evaluation. The oil remains in the ground, the carbon remains in the air, the laborers remain forgotten, and the house on the hill continues to command its view. The view has not changed, but the way we see it can. Imagine a different tour. Not the standard parade through grand rooms, repeated rehearsed facts about architects and acquisition dates. Not a sanitized narrative celebrating philanthropy and public service. Something harder, something truer. A tour that holds beauty and cost in the same frame. Perhaps it begins not at the main entrance, but at the service gate, the path the workers themselves used. The road where delivery wagons arrived daily, supplying a household that could number dozens. Visitors would enter as the staff once did, past utilitarian outbuildings that made grandeur possible. The first stop might be the underground tunnels. These passageways, constructed so servants could move unseen, are themselves evidence of a social philosophy. The family above, the workers below. Two worlds connected yet never intended to intersect. A guide could explain not only the function of the tunnels, but what they communicated. Assumptions about class and labor literally cast into concrete and stone. From there, the tour could move to the kitchen, not as a nostalgic relic of a bygone era, but as a workplace. How many meals were prepared each day? How many hours were spent on aching feet? What were the names of the cooks, the assistants, the staff whose labor enabled the household to function? Where records exist, and in some cases they do, the guide could speak those names aloud. Every corridor, every corner, every back staircase could tell the story of those who made Kykuit what it was. Visitors could learn that the estate's beauty was not accidental. It was the product of unseen hands, of toil that often left no trace but the smooth stone, the planted flower, the shining silver. The tour would not diminish Kykuit's elegance. The house would still impress, the gardens would still enchant, the art would still captivate. What would change is perspective. Visitors would leave not with a story of wealth alone, but with the fuller ledger. Beauty built on labor, philanthropy built on industry, history measured in both stone and human effort. This is the truth Kykuit and the Rockefeller legacy asks us to confront. It is complicated, uncomfortable, and incomplete. Yet in embracing it, we honor both the grandeur and the ghosts who made it possible. A small act of remembrance, a refusal to let the workers vanish entirely into the shadows. The servants' quarters would come first. Narrow rooms, shared bathrooms, the bell system that summoned staff to tend to the family's every need. Visitors could see the contrast with their own eyes, the cramped spaces where laborers slept, lived, and moved, versus the expansive halls where the Rockefellers entertained. No heavy-handed narration would be necessary. The architecture would speak for itself. Only after walking the corridors of labor would the tour move into the main house, and here the approach would shift again. The grand rooms would still be shown, the tapestries would still be admired, the views would still command awe. But the narrative surrounding them would be different. Where did the money come from that purchased this marble? What was happening in the refineries while this wallpaper was being hung? The beauty would remain undeniable, but it would be placed back into the human and economic context that made it possible. In the dining room, a guide might read from Ida Tarbell's exposé, passages detailing Standard Oil's tactics against competitors. Then, without editorializing, the guide could note that this same room hosted dinners attended by presidents, industrialists, artists, and intellectuals. The fortune that Tarbell had documented as predatory also funded the meals at this table. Both facts, same room. The art collection would demand the same treatment. The Picassos and Calders in the gardens are genuinely extraordinary, forming one of the finest private collections of modern sculpture in the United States. Yet these works were purchased with money that traces directly to kerosene, railroads, secret rebates, and the ruin of rivals. A tour that mentions only their aesthetic value is incomplete. One that acknowledges both beauty and provenance is honest. This honesty would extend to the philanthropy. A quiet room or shaded terrace could be dedicated to the Rockefeller Foundation's achievements: hookworm eradication, yellow fever research, medical schools, research institutes. Lives saved, communities transformed, tangible good that cannot be disputed. But the tour would not end there. Without softening the tone, the guide could explain the Foundation's support for eugenics research, the grants funding studies meant to influence who should have children. The same institution simultaneously producing progressive public health campaigns and pseudo-scientific racism financed by the same fortune. Not to condemn, but to complicate. Not to vilify, but to resist the simplistic narrative of villain or hero. The tour would conclude on the terrace overlooking the Hudson River, the hills stretching beyond, the same panorama John D. Rockefeller once beheld when purchasing this land over a century ago. A guide could pose a challenge to visitors: hold two thoughts at once. First, the view is genuinely beautiful. The gardens are extraordinary, the craftsmanship remarkable. This is a place worth preserving, visiting, admiring. Second, this beauty came at a price. The workers who built the terraces, the servants who maintained them, the competitors crushed to generate the fortune, they are also part of this landscape, even if invisible. To see only the beauty is to see incompletely. To see only the cost is also incomplete. The honest view includes both. Such a tour would be uncomfortable. It would not leave visitors with tidy feelings. Some might depart angry at the Rockefellers, at the system, at history itself. Some might leave defensive, their enjoyment of beauty unsettled by unwelcome complexity. Others might walk quietly, thoughtful, wrestling with questions that do not resolve neatly. All responses would be valid. The goal is not to dictate emotion. It is to provide enough of the story to feel something real. The mansions of the Gilded Age will endure. They will stand for generations, attracting tourists, hosting events, serving as backdrops for films and photographs. The question is not whether they will exist, but what story they will tell. They can tell a narrative of wealth and taste, philanthropy and service, or they can tell a fuller story, one that includes workers, servants, competitors, cost. The stones themselves do not change, only the tour does.
The tour ends. Visitors leave. The house stays. This is the strange permanence of architecture. The people who built Kykuit are gone. The family, the architects, the stonemasons, the gardeners. The debates that raged in John D. Rockefeller's lifetime have faded into historical footnotes. The newspapers that called him criminal and the newspapers that called him saint have both crumbled into archives. But the house remains. The stone remains. The view remains. And so the question passes to us, not to the Rockefellers, who made their choices long ago, not to the workers, who often had little choice at all, but to us, visitors, tourists, citizens inheriting a landscape shaped by forces beyond our control. What do we do with it? One answer is simple: enjoy it. The gardens are beautiful. The art is significant. The history is fascinating. Millions of people visit Gilded Age mansions every year, and most leave satisfied, having seen something impressive, learned something new, experienced a pleasant afternoon in historic surroundings. This answer is not wrong. Beauty has value. Preservation has value. The craftsmanship on display at Kykuit represents rare skills and traditions that might otherwise vanish. There is nothing shameful in admiring a well-built building, even if the money behind it came from sources we would question today. But there is another answer, more demanding. It insists that enjoyment alone is not enough. History is not merely spectacle, but conversation. The mansions of the Gilded Age are not only relics, they are ongoing arguments about wealth, inequality, labor, power, and the stories we choose to tell about ourselves. This answer asks visitors to do more than look. It asks them to think, to ask questions, to connect the stone on the terrace to the refineries in Cleveland, the gardens to the hands that planted them, the philanthropy to the fortune that funded it. It asks us to hold complexity, resist simple judgments, and sit with discomfort.
Both answers have their place. Not every visit to a historic site needs to be a moral reckoning. Sometimes a garden is just a garden. Sometimes a view shared with friends or family is enough for that day. But the question lingers, because the issues the Rockefeller story raises are not safely confined to the past. They are here today, in new forms, but with familiar shapes. Modern fortunes rival or exceed those of the Gilded Age. Technology companies concentrate wealth at scales that would astonish John D. Rockefeller. The founders of these enterprises face the same question he did: what to do with money that exceeds any one individual's capacity to spend. They reach for the same tools: philanthropy, foundations, public works, and the slow, deliberate rehabilitation of reputations tarnished by aggressive business practices. History offers no simple lessons, but it offers perspective. The mansions and gardens, the collections and foundations, the views and terraces all persist as evidence of choices made and consequences endured. To walk them is to confront beauty and labor, wealth and cost, creation and erasure. To leave without acknowledgement is to leave half the story untold. To engage fully is to see history whole, to honor those visible and invisible, and to recognize that the landscape we inherit is never neutral. It is an argument, an invitation, and a challenge. And so the question remains, waiting for each visitor: what will you see? What will you remember? And when you look back, who do you carry with you? The family whose name is carved into the stone, or the ghosts whose labor made it all possible? The mansions of the 21st century may not resemble Kykuit. They may rise as private islands in tropical waters, sprawling desert compounds, clandestine space programs, or vast digital empires contained within anonymous server farms. Yet the underlying dynamic remains unchanged: immense wealth amassed through market dominance, seeking legitimacy through acts of giving.
The critics are still with us. They ask the same questions the commentators of Rockefeller's era posed. Can philanthropy atone for exploitation? Should private individuals wield the power to shape public policy through donations? Is charity a substitute for justice or a way to avoid it? These questions do not yield definitive answers. They are not puzzles to be solved once and for all, but tensions to be managed. Each generation must confront them in its own time, armed with its own understanding of fairness and responsibility. What the mansions offer is a space to think. The stone, the gardens, the rooms preserved with meticulous care, they are evidence of one set of answers. They reflect the solutions the Rockefellers offered to the dilemmas of their era. Whether those solutions were sufficient, flawed, visionary, or morally compromised is for visitors to decide. The house does not judge, it simply stands, and perhaps that is its ultimate lesson. Buildings outlast the intentions behind them. John D. Rockefeller built Kykuit to secure a legacy, to demonstrate taste, to provide refuge from the demands of public life. He could not have imagined the tours that would one day traverse his private rooms, the questions strangers would pose about his fortune, the debates that would echo more than a century after his death. The house escaped his control. It became public property, not in law, but in culture. It belongs now to anyone who enters, anyone who contemplates it, anyone who uses it as a lens to examine the past and the present. This is the fate of all monuments. Built to say one thing, they end up saying many. Constructed to close questions, they open them instead. Built to last, they endure long enough to be reinterpreted by generations the builders never anticipated. Kykuit stands on its hill above the Hudson. The view remains breathtaking. The stone remains unyielding. The questions remain open. How we answer them is ours to decide.
What we see depends in part on what we inherit. The Rockefeller descendants inherited money, property, and expectation. They inherited a name that opened doors and a history that raised questions. They inherited the project of legacy building that John D. Rockefeller began, and that each subsequent generation has had to continue, revise, or resist. But inheritance is not limited to families. We all inherit the world that came before us, the roads and institutions, the economic systems, the unspoken rules governing wealth creation and distribution, the assumptions about who deserves what and what the powerful owe to everyone else. These inheritances shape our lives, whether we acknowledge them or not. The Gilded Age bequeathed America a particular bundle of inheritances: industrial infrastructure that propelled the nation to global power, universities, hospitals, and museums that defined cultural life, labor movements that fought for better conditions and secured legal protections, and the mansions, vast monuments to extreme inequality. These inheritances are not separate, they are tangled, cause and effect woven so tightly that pulling one thread risks unraveling the whole fabric. The same fortunes that built the mansions also built the universities. The same labor that was exploited in the refineries also won the 8-hour day through struggle and sacrifice. The same inequality that concentrated wealth also produced philanthropic institutions shaping American society for more than a century. To inherit this history is to inherit contradictions. The descendant of a refinery worker and the descendant of a Rockefeller alike live in a country shaped by Standard Oil, by its efficiency and its predation, by its wealth creation and its concentration. Neither can fully escape that legacy. Both must decide what to do with it. For the Rockefeller family, this decision has taken many forms. Some descendants have embraced philanthropy, dedicating themselves to foundations and causes the family long supported. Others have pursued careers in politics, finance, or the arts, using the family name as a platform while charting their own path. Still others have sought distance from the legacy, uneasy with the weight of expectation or the moral complexity attached to their last name.
The fourth and fifth generations face challenges their great-great-grandfather could never have imagined. The fortune, though still substantial, has been divided among hundreds of descendants. The name, though recognizable, no longer carries the same automatic authority. The world has changed. Questions about wealth and responsibility are more urgent than ever. Climate change presents the starkest challenge. The Rockefeller fortune was built on fossil fuels, the very substances now destabilizing the planet. To be a Rockefeller heir in the 21st century is to inherit not just wealth, but a direct historical connection to the carbon economy. Some family members have responded by funding climate research and clean energy initiatives. Others have publicly advocated divestment from fossil fuels. The Family Foundation's 2014 decision to divest was a statement both practical and symbolic, a recognition that the source of the fortune had become morally and economically untenable. Yet divestment does not undo history. The carbon already in the atmosphere remains. Communities already disrupted by extraction remain displaced. Infrastructure built around fossil fuels continues to shape billions of lives. The Rockefeller contribution to climate change cannot be erased like a mismanaged investment. It is embedded in the physical world, in landscapes and air, in energy grids and oceans, in the lives of generations. This is the essence of inheritance. Inheritance is not neutral. It is a burden, a responsibility, a challenge. The question is what we choose to do with what we receive, whether we pass it along unexamined or whether we act with awareness, acknowledging both the benefits and the costs. The Gilded Age fortune, its consequences, and its legacies are a lens through which we can examine every era, including our own. Every monument, every estate, every foundation, every public park holds a story. It is a story of vision and taste, of wealth and labor, of ambition and compromise. To inherit is not simply to receive, it is to reckon with history, with morality, with choices made long before one's birth. The mansions of the Gilded Age, the institutions the Rockefellers built, and even the fortunes of today's titans of technology all confront us with the same question: what will we do with what we inherit, and what will we leave for the next generation?
Kykuit still overlooks the Hudson. The gardens bloom, the stone stands solid, the questions remain unanswered. The beauty is undeniable, the cost is undeniable, and the choices are ours to make. It cannot simply be refused, it can only be managed, redirected, responded to. The inheritors of the Rockefeller legacy, and more broadly, the inheritors of the Gilded Age, operate within constraints they did not create. They must work with the materials they have been given, and the mansions are part of those materials. Kykuit and the other great houses now serve purposes their builders never imagined. They are classrooms, in a sense, spaces where Americans can confront the intertwined histories of wealth and labor that shaped the nation. They are warnings, monuments to an inequality that nearly tore the country apart and, in altered forms, threatens to do so again. They are resources, assets to be used for education, preservation, and public benefit if handled with care. What the inheritors choose to do with these resources matters, but so does what the rest of us do. The mansions belong, in a meaningful cultural sense, to everyone who walks their halls, studies their records, debates their meaning. We are all inheritors of the world that the Gilded Age produced. The questions it posed, the limits of accumulation, the obligations of wealth, the dignity of labor, are ours as well. Each generation must answer them anew. The answers offered by John D. Rockefeller's generation are etched in the stone at Kykuit. The responses of subsequent generations are visible in foundations, divestments, and ongoing debates about philanthropy and power. The answers our generation provides are still being formed. The house on the hill watches and waits. It has witnessed fortunes rise and fall, reputations forged and destroyed, questions asked and deferred. It will see more. The stone is patient. What we inherit is fixed. What we do with it is not. What we do with inheritance begins with what we are willing to say. For decades, the story of Kykuit was told in a particular register. The official narrative emphasized beauty, taste, philanthropy, and public service. Tours followed predictable paths through grand rooms, reciting architects' names, cataloging artworks, highlighting family contributions to American life. The silence surrounding more difficult topics was rarely overtly defensive. It was procedural, embedded in the logic of historic preservation. Historic house museums existed to preserve and celebrate, not to interrogate. This silence had texture.
It threaded through every corridor where the source of the fortune went unspoken, every room where the lives of servants were briefly acknowledged, every garden where the laborers who planted and maintained it remained invisible. The silence was not a lie, it was an omission, a choice about what was considered worth speaking aloud. Silences like this are common across historic sites. They accumulate over decades, becoming part of the institutional culture, shaping expectations and guiding the behavior of guides and visitors alike. Breaking them requires effort, deliberate intention, and a willingness to confront discomfort. It requires asking whether the story being told is complete and considering what might be gained by telling it differently. At some Gilded Age estates, the silence has begun to lift. Tours now explore the lives of servants, exhibits acknowledge the labor that built the estates, oral history projects capture memories before they vanish entirely. The shift is gradual, incomplete, contested, but it is happening. Kykuit has participated cautiously in this movement. Tours of the servants' quarters are now available. Staff lives are acknowledged, if not fully explored. The narrative has expanded, incorporating at least some of the people who made the house function.
Yet much remains unspoken. The connection between the mansion and the refineries that generated the fortune is rarely drawn explicitly. The workers who died in Standard Oil facilities are not commemorated on the grounds they helped fund. The predatory practices Ida Tarbell documented, practices later confirmed by the Supreme Court, are absent from the Standard Tour. The silence around these subjects remains heavy, almost palpable. This caution is understandable. Historic Hudson Valley, which operates Kykuit, must balance obligations to historical accuracy, visitor experience, site preservation, and relationships with donors and communities. A tour that dwelt relentlessly on the darker aspects of the Rockefeller fortune might alienate visitors and undermine the institution's mission. There are legitimate reasons for discretion, but discretion carries costs. A narrative that omits the difficult parts is a narrative that distorts. Visitors who learn only of beauty and philanthropy depart with an incomplete picture, not just of the Rockefellers, but of American history itself, how wealth is accumulated and maintained, and what inequality looks like when carved into stone. The question is not whether the entire story can be told. No tour can contain the whole of history. Time is finite, attention is scarce, history is inexhaustible. The question is which parts of the story are deemed essential, which are optional, which voices are amplified, and which are silenced. At most Gilded Age mansions, the family story is mandatory. The worker's story is optional. Architectural achievements are essential. The labor conditions that made them possible are supplementary. Philanthropy is highlighted. The sources of wealth hum in the background. Reversing this hierarchy entirely would neither be possible nor desirable. The mansion's significance derives in part from their design, their beauty, their architectural history. That significance is real and worth preserving.
But rebalancing is possible. A tour could give equal weight to the people who built the house and the people who owned it. An exhibit could place the refineries alongside the foundations. A garden walk could name the gardeners, not just the landscape architect. These adjustments would not diminish the house, they would deepen it. The stone would remain beautiful, the views would remain breathtaking, but the meaning of that beauty would be richer, more honest, more true. Silence is a choice. What we choose not to say is as significant as what we say. The silences at Kykuit and across America's Gilded Age mansions are decisions made by institutions and individuals alike, decisions that can be revisited, revised, reconsidered. The stone cannot speak for itself. It depends on the people who walk through its rooms, who write its tours, who choose which stories to tell and which to leave unspoken. The stone is patient, but it is also passive. It will bear any narrative we impose upon it. For more than a century, the story told at Kykuit was one of taste, permanence, and redemption through philanthropy.
A story crafted by the family, preserved by the institutions that inherited their legacy. It served purposes, yes, but it also obscured truths. That story can change. The stone permits it. History demands it. What remains is the courage to speak. The willingness to speak is how the story endures. Years from now, a school group will arrive at Kykuit. Children will tumble from a bus, chatter spilling over the gates, distracted the way children always are. When history arrives in the form of a field trip, they will see the stone façade, the meticulously planned gardens, the sweeping view down to the Hudson River. Some will yawn, some will marvel, and a few will carry this day with them, tucked into memory. A guide will lead them through the rooms. By then, perhaps, the tour will have evolved. Perhaps the servants' quarters will receive as much attention as the Grand Hall.
Perhaps the link between the mansion and the refineries that built it will be drawn with clarity. No euphemisms, no apology. Perhaps the names of the workers who appear in the surviving records will be spoken aloud, given the same weight as the architects and landscape designers. A child will pause at the stone lions flanking the entrance, noticing a detail adults might miss, and the question will come. The question children always ask, the question adults learn to suppress. Did the people who built this get anything from it? The guide will hesitate. This is the moment that matters. The answer cannot be simple. Not a yes or no, not a comforting reassurance, not a tidy dismissal. Some did, the guide might say. Some did not. The workers who built the house were paid. For many it was better than the alternatives. But some were injured. Some died. Their names are mostly lost. The servants who lived here had steady work and shelter, but they labored long hours in a system that rendered them nearly invisible. The family gave away hundreds of millions of dollars, helping to save countless lives. They also amassed their fortune through practices later ruled illegal. Both truths coexist. To remember only one is to tell an incomplete story. Our task is to remember all of it. The child may not grasp the full weight of this history, but something will register. That history is never simple, that buildings hold stories heavier than stone, that memory requires effort. The group will move on, the guide will continue, the house will endure. But somewhere near the back of the line, a child will glance back at the lions, tracing their contours with a thoughtful eye, thinking, briefly, quietly, about the hands that carved them, hands that belonged to someone with a name, a family, a life beyond this hill. And in that glance, history begins, not in the stone, not in the gardens, not in the art or the philanthropy, but in recognition, in attention, in the choice to see what was always there, hidden in plain sight.